Hello, friends. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Before I introduce the guest this week, I just want to touch on a few things. One is I just put out a ebook on how to start a podcast. It literally has everything you need to start a podcast, to grow one, to monetize one, to reach out to guests. Everything, really. It's 100 plus pages packed with all the information you need if you're interested in starting a podcast for whatever reason, maybe because you think it's a cool hobby, maybe you think it's what you're going to be the next Joe Rogan, whatever your reason, it's a great tool. So I wanted to pack all the information that I've accumulated over that time and put it into a digestible ebook that is easy, zero fluff, just all info, all insights, great examples I've used from myself and other people. So please go check it out. I'm going to put it in the show notes. It's on Gumroad. I really appreciate it. I think it's a great ebook. Again, packed with information. Go check it out. And as far as the podcast itself, as always, please subscribe, rate, review, follow, all the good stuff. It helps boost the podcast ratings, therefore more visible and a greater audience, greater reach, helping me to grow the podcast. So I really appreciate it. And on to the guest. This week I have Nick Hunt. Nick is a freelance writer. He's a storyteller. He's also an author of 4 books, the latest being Outlandish, Walking Europe's Unlikely Landscapes. And I believe he told me that one is going to be released October 26th in the US. So make sure to go check it out. Again, everything's in the show notes. Nick also did an amazing walk, the same walk that Patrick Leigh Fermor did in 1933. And he wrote a book about it. And essentially 78 years later, Nick decided to kind of follow in this author's footsteps. And he walked through Holland, Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and ended up in Turkey. And through it, he met people. He saw the kindness of strangers. He experienced freedom and wilderness and adventure. And what I found fascinating is every day I see about this new adventurer or explorer doing these amazing feats, right? But they're always the fastest, the tallest, the strongest. Like, how am I going to reach a new height? How am I going to get to some unexplored place or get there faster? And this is kind of the opposite. This is walking in his own pace, not trying to set some sort of a world record, just trying to absorb the places, the people. And it's just such a different pace to what we regularly look at for when we think of adventures. So I just thought the whole idea was pretty cool. I thought Nick was a great speaker. I heard his TED Talk, which was awesome. And yeah, I was really happy to have him on. We talked about, obviously, the adventure that he had, walking those 8 months and all the great things and, the hardships that came along with that. All right, so without further ado, let me introduce this week's guest, Nick Hunt. Enjoy the episode, everyone.
The Genuinely Interested Podcast.
Nick Hunt, how are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you.
Thanks for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I love your TED Talk, and I've been wanting to talk to you for a minute. So thanks again for doing the podcast.
You're very welcome. It's great to be here.
So for people who may not know, maybe a little bit of an introduction. And I also don't know, I know what I've kind of did a little bit of research on you, but I also want to know obviously more about you. You walked for 8 months from Holland through Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and you ended up in Turkey as a final destination. Why? Why did you do that?
Yeah, so that was, I guess that was kind of one of the, the things you do in life where your life changes direction slightly. It felt like the kind of start of the current phase of my life and my current career, which is often writing about walking.
Okay.
So this journey was it started with reading a book that may be familiar to some listeners. Perhaps it's just been reissued, in fact, by my publisher John Murray. Patrick Leigh Fermor, A Time of Gifts. Now, Patrick Leigh Fermor became a kind of war hero in the Second World War and a kind of travel writer. He's the kind of up there at the sort of, people really have huge amount of respect for his work. But when he was 18, he walked the same route that I would end up walking, kind of just for the hell of it. He was 18. It was 1933. He didn't know what to do with his life. He was just a kind of teenager who wanted an adventure, and he was quite well read in kind of sort of history of Central Europe, and he had lots of quite romantic ideas about these kind of wonderful destinations, and he just set off, in his words, like a tramp, a pilgrim, or a wandering scholar.
Yeah,
and he kind of encapsulates all of those things. And so his A Time of Gifts and his later books, Between the Woods and the Water and The Broken Road, cover this amazing journey from 1933 to 1934, where he saw, he's kind of captured this Europe that was about to change. He was walking through Germany, hearing about this guy called Hitler, who was just coming to power, and everyone thought it was a bit ridiculous.
Yeah.
And he saw stormtroopers marching in the streets and kind of, didn't really think much of it. And then ended up the guest of various kind of counts and aristocrats in Hungary and Romania, this social class that would just be liquidated, shortly afterwards.
Yeah.
After the war, after communism. So he saw this kind of the last of this medieval Europe, I'd say, with peasants working in the fields and aristocrats in their castles. And he wrote about it in what a wonderful way that kind of combines him as a young man having an adventure and him as a much older man, much more learned and having, seen more and learnt more. So it's deeply kind of scholarly at the same time as being adventurous and kind of free. And I was very much inspired by this book when I was 18, and I kind of just put it at the back of my mind, I'd like to do that one day. I will follow that walk.
Mm-hmm.
And got to the age of 30, and sometimes you realize you've got these dreams in your head, and then as you get a bit older, you suddenly realize that time is not infinite and that you might not actually do them unless you just do them.
Yeah.
So what I did, and I think this is quite a good way of starting something difficult, is a year in advance. I knew the date I wanted to leave in early December, the same date that he set out. And I told about 10 people, in a year's time, I'm going to start this walk to Turkey.
Okay.
And it's quite a good insurance policy, because if 10 people are expecting you to do something, you've got 10 people who are going to say, oh, I thought you were meant to be walking to Turkey now.
Yeah.
What's going on? So I kind of had to do it. I sort of put myself in that position where I'd had to start. And that's how I started off walking to Istanbul.
Wow. So is there an actual trail, like for example, here you have, Appalachian Trail or Pacific Crest Trail, where it's an actual trail that people go from A to B. Is it an actual trail, or is it just a general direction that you followed that he did?
There's no trail at all.
Okay.
What I did was use his books as a kind of very, very out-of-date guidebook.
I see.
So he's very accurate in the villages and the routes he took, but he wrote about this journey decades after he actually did it. And so it was really interesting. There were lots of, obviously there were lots of sections. I didn't know the exact route he walked. I knew he went from this town to this village. So I try and guess the way that, one would go. But in the time in between, there might be a motorway or autobahn, or an industrial estate.
Yeah.
In the way. So it was a kind of every day was a sort of navigation of this terrain, trying to stick to what I imagined his route had been.
Was it comparable in the sense of like what you read, what your expectation was, and what the reality was doing it? Because, I'm assuming you said 1933. I mean, it's close to 100 years, right? You were 90 years or so. What was the reality versus the imagination that you had in your head of what this walk was going to be?
Well, I mean, I expected more concrete and more cars. There is more concrete and more cars.
Yeah.
But I think I really had it in my head when I started out that I would be documenting this kind of devastated continent that had been bombed and covered in shopping malls and, that kind of thing. And actually, it was a lot more relatable than I expected. I mean, yes, the kind of medieval cities in a lot of Europe have been flattened and kind of rebuilt, normally in the most ugly possible way. But that kind of rural identity still comes through, and it changed as I walked. So the further east I got, the closer the landscape got to what Paddy had seen. And it was interesting because in countries like Romania, arguably Romania had one of the biggest social changes. It had a kind of complete turned upside down under communism, sort of turned inside out. Yeah. The entire social class kind of liquidated or exiled, and Ceausescu had this idea of completely demolishing the kind of medieval landscape and making it industrial to kind of make this new, the sort of new socialist utopia. Mm-hmm. And Romania was, very similar, I'd imagine, in parts to what he saw. There's still horse-drawn traffic. There's still people working small-scale plots of land that are kind of organic because they've always been organic and that's the way they farm. So, yeah, there was a lot more similarities than I expected.
Did you do any, because I mean, this is a big undertaking, right? Like it's a long time. It's a lot of countries. It's probably, I mean, maybe not super expensive, but probably, financially a little bit of a burden. Did you do any smaller challenges prior to this, maybe to get yourself in walking shape, or you were just like, all right, I'm going all in on this one big thing and let's do it?
I went all in, and actually it wasn't the wisest. I had a very naive view that walking is it's natural activity. Mm-hmm. You don't need to train to walk. And I've always walked, I've always done walks, and was pretty fit. But there was a couple of fairly major injuries on the way that I think could have been avoided just with a little bit more care and planning. I got shin splints, which is sort of agonizing. Ooh. In my first week.
Yeah. Oh, first week.
First week, yeah.
Wow.
And then in Germany, I got something more serious. It was kind of Achilles tendon strain. And so I was laid up in sweat in a city called Ulm, mm-hmm. that Paddy had walked through kind of as winter was coming. And it was one of those injuries where the doctor kind of says, this could take 3 days, it could take 3 weeks, it could take 3 months. I can't tell you.
Yeah.
So that was pretty dispiriting because it seemed for a while like I was just going to have to get on a train home. But it was okay. It did get better, and I was able to carry on.
How much, on average, how many hours did you walk a day?
I mean, it was that was my daily job, so it would probably be between 6 to 8 hours, mostly walking most days. I have to say, I kind of, everything got more relaxed. The further east I got, it's partly the culture, it's partly the landscape, which is more rural, less, people are less busy. Mm-hmm. And I found that there was a real difference in kind of, I mean, I should say at the start that everyone was hospitable. I never had any bad encounters. I was welcomed, offered accommodation across the continent, which was astonishing.
Yeah.
But there was a sort of shift in emphasis. So in Germany, So the people I stayed with would say, you know, when do you leave? When do you have to leave? And then in Romania and Bulgaria would say, how long can you stay? And then they'd always say, oh, you know, it's a shame because we're having a picnic, or it's my granddad's birthday in 2 days. You know,
Yeah.
So I found that I always would be given more excuses to travel slower. Once I'd got past sort of Austrian-Slovakian border.
Do you know any other language besides English?
Spanish, which
doesn't help. Maybe in Romania a little bit, no?
It did. Yeah, Romania was the first time I kind of could recognize words and guess at words. I mean, I was in Germany for quite a long time, and in Germanic, you know, I was from Holland to Germany to Austria. It's a similar language, you know, it's a language family.
Yeah.
And I did pick up, you know, enough to kind of get by. And then suddenly, I mean, I had a little bit of Russian as well. So Slovakia, it's definitely not Russian, but it's not a million miles away.
Yeah.
Hungary, of course, was utterly different to anything. Hungarian has no, you know, nothing, no footholds or handholds to grab onto whatsoever.
So, I mean, what do you do? Do you just pray that you find someone that knows English, or do you start, you know, face gestures, hand gestures, I don't know, Google Translate? Like, how do you break that initial barrier?
Yeah, it's a mixture of everything. I'd always, you know, walking is good for practicing. So I'd practice words in my head and practice phrases, you know, look them up, write them down, try and memorize enough to establish. I mean, often the important thing I found was just establishing what I was doing, because people look at you strangely sometimes if you turn up in a tiny village that never gets anyone coming to it. And I'm dirty, I'm unshaven, you know, probably stink. I've got a bag on my back. People don't know who I am, what I'm doing, where I'm going. So just knowing enough in the language to say, I very rarely said I'm walking to Istanbul, because I thought people would just think I was nuts.
Yeah.
So I would say I'm walking to, and find like the nearest town that might be a conceivable destination. And often people, once they sort of knew that that's what I was doing, that explained me, then people were quite friendly and relaxed. Once I had a reason for being there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was bits of English, bits of whatever languages we might have in common, lots of gesturing, lots of miming. One of my best moments was arriving in Romania and being given the entire history of Romania, from the Roman invasion of ancient Dacia right up until the fall of communism, by a drunken farmer in mime. So he was doing everything. He was doing Napoleon, he was doing the Second World War, the Roman Empire, in these kind of increasingly mad charades.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm sure I missed a lot, but I also enjoyed that so much. It was such a kind of great way to encounter a culture.
No, for sure. I remember when I was in Japan last year, just right before COVID, and everyone had masks on, and they didn't speak, you know, a lick of English. And, you know, I've traveled, and every place you go, you can kind of figure it out. The problem I ran into was, because of the masks, I had a very hard time reading facial gestures, and I could not comprehend what they were trying to say. You know, when you speak with your face, there's certain things that I can pick up, but with the mask, I couldn't pick up anything, and they didn't know English. And I found that to be a little bit of a barrier. And I'm like, if I could only see your face, I could probably understand so much more, you know? Yeah,
that's really interesting. Yeah, we don't know how much we pick up from those universal muscular gestures.
Yeah.
But it's actually, this December is going to be the 10-year anniversary of me doing this walk. And I'd love to write something about the changes in the last 10 years, because yes, I mean, COVID and the idea of wandering from village to village, meeting people feels a lot more difficult for obvious reasons. There's also, since then there's been the refugee crisis in Europe. So there's been, I think, in a lot of countries, notably Hungary, a lot more hostility to people wandering around. The borders have become stronger. I think there's kind of razor wire fences in places that I probably just walked through without being asked for anything. And then there's Brexit as well. So that's another, it's just all of these barriers have kind of come up in the last 10 years. And I wonder how different it would be. I mean, it may be that it would be no different at all today, because I think people seem to have a similar attitude towards hospitality despite the Second World War and 50 years of communism.
Yeah.
So maybe these changes actually haven't been as significant as they seem.
Well, I think there's two worlds that are happening right now. There's the online world and there's the real world. And on the online world, where algorithms are set up to infuriate us and to, the things that cause the most outrage are the things that reach the top. Therefore, you get to see those, and therefore you go to the comments, and where the comments that's where the most engagement happens, and the most fighting, and the most vile things. And you're like, wow, the world's it's going to shit. Look at all these people, and everyone's arguing. I can't believe they're doing that, and just outrage. And then, for the most part, when you're out in the streets and you go to new places, a couple of months ago I drove out west to the Midwest, actually to Oklahoma. And, there's all these perceptions that come with that, right? Like, oh, people are going to be this way. They're going to be that way. Everyone was nice. Everyone was hospitable and polite. And it was a delight to go out there. So I think that's a little bit of what's happening right now. There's the online world, which is driving us all insane. And then in the real world, for the most part, everyone's pretty nice. Everyone's okay,
Yeah. I mean, that reminds me the Oklahoma thing of once I got to Slovakia, there was this real kind of typical kind of Eastern European stereotype kicked in, where the Slovakians said, oh, you don't want to go to Hungary, they're terrible in Hungary, they'll rob you and they're awful people. And then the Hungarians said the same about the Romanians, the Romanians said the same about the Bulgarians said the same about the Turks. And if anything, it got friendlier with each border I crossed.
Really,
it seemed like the opposite of kind of people's dire predictions about how I would be treated. So these kind of old historical enmities are still simmering.
Why do you think neighbors never get along? This is something that's always boggled my mind. Look anywhere in the world, and this isn't 100%, but it's pretty accurate. Most neighboring nations, and sometimes even cities and, micronations, whatever, they just don't get along with the people next to them. Why? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's a hard one, isn't it? I mean, a lot of the kind of, obviously in Europe, there has been recent bloodshed in a lot of places, and a lot, people remember it's not so long ago that these countries were pitted against each other.
Yeah.
But it seems to happen everywhere, doesn't it? It just seems to be a thing that people do.
It's just we can't get along with each other for some reason.
Yeah. But often people say that, and then day to day they probably do. I mean, I'm sure the people at these kind of border regions who are saying such dire things have a lot of contact with people over the border. There's borders are mostly open. There's trade going on. There's kind of families living half in one place and half in another.
Yeah.
And I'd find there was interesting kind of little changes. So especially around Slovakia, I'd find it was quite hard to find the name that Patrick Leigh Fermor had given for his destination was in Hungarian when he did it, and had been kind of Slovakianized.
Okay.
So there'd been this kind of population shifts or cultural shifts that had happened since, where people just didn't live in the same place, or they changed the language they spoke in.
Was there a reason he chose this specific path there's so many places, right? The world's massive. You can go to Asia or Africa, or maybe some more unexplored area. You can run, you can mountaineer, you can get on a kayak. Like there's so many ways to do adventure. And it seems like walking through Europe, especially these countries, is kind of like, it's not what we attribute to adventure nowadays, right? Now adventure is it has to be the biggest, the boldest, the craziest, the fastest. And this is like, no, this is going to be the slowest. It's almost like the opposite, right? Of what we're looking at as adventure. I'm just interested in like why the specific route and why the specific like method of adventure.
Yeah, I think he wanted to go to Istanbul, that he persisted in calling Constantinople, part of his sort of slightly medievalist kind of fantasy.
Okay.
And, he went vaguely southeast, which is the kind of most direct way to get there. And just kind of his route was very much informed by people he met, telling him where to go next and points of interest on the way, kind of castles and manor houses and sites of battles and kind of things that kind of tugged at his imagination. So yeah, it was very, and then walking. I mean, I guess it's what I found is it's the way to kind of, if you're traveling through somewhere, it's the way to experience it in the deepest possible, fullest possible way.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. There were kind of a few times when I had to I think I got in a car maybe 6 weeks into my walk. And it was I stayed with someone who was going to it was a New Year's Eve party, and they were going to a New Year's Eve party in the next town, which was my next destination. But for me, that was a day's walk, that I'd planned to get there. Okay. And they were like, oh, just, we're going to go to the party here, jump in the car. It took, 20 minutes. And I found it was amazing how disorientating it was and how kind of upsetting it was to be traveling at such speed. And I kept thinking, I'm missing out on all of this stuff. Like we crossed over the river Rhine and it was just a flash, under the bridge. And I thought that would have been a day of walking along the banks and kind of, it was amazing how kind of confusing that experience was and how wrong it felt. And I really felt like I just missed something very important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially nowadays, right? We're in this era of, obviously speed is a major thing, but also living vicariously through our phones, right? We're documenting everything. And I always have this like, because I'm an amateur photographer. I like taking pictures, especially out in nature. And I do both with my phone and with my camera. And then oftentimes I'm like, am I missing out on actually being in this place and seeing it and experiencing and, touching the grass and smelling the air? Or am I just taking a picture, taking a snap, for posterity's sake or for the, a few likes on Instagram and then moving on to the next, and I didn't really get to experience it the way I wanted to,
Yeah.
That's always kind of, it's always a battle I have in my head.
My kind of amateur theory about that, because I take pictures too, and it's the times when you actually say you have to look, at the kind of top of a mountain and looking at this vast swathe of land below, it's utterly exhausting and kind of terrifying to actually try and take that in. Mm-hmm. It's too big and it's just, I think it's something that your brain it can only process a tiny bit of it.
Yeah.
And taking a picture, I think it kind of satisfies you that you have somehow absorbed the experience. And I feel that satisfaction for sure. It's just like, oh, good. It's kind of inside me now. It's, I've kind of literally taken it in, but it's the shortcut to doing it. And I think, the times I've, actually kind of really tried to look at a vast vista of space is it's a very difficult thing to do. I think it would probably drive you mad if you really took it all in.
Yeah, I mean, it could. It's so beautiful, right? It's yeah, no, it's one of those things. I wish I could. I don't think I'll ever have an answer. I think it'll probably just something that'll always be with me. It's just like I'll have to figure it out. Like, do I want to spend more time taking those photos, documenting the moment, or quote unquote, air quotes, being in the moment and just enjoying this and maybe taking a mental note so that I can look back on it. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever have a clear cut answer for that one.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing with walking, being in the moment. You can't really help but be in the moment.
Do you get like into a meditative state when you're walking, or is it just like, because I'm assuming you're not reading when you're walking, you're not on your phone probably most of the time when you're walking, unless maybe some GPS stuff. Like, what do you kind of think about? Is it just, do you go into a mode, a zone, meditation, or just a lot of, I don't know, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, on a good day, it was a meditative thing.
Okay.
I had a couple of days where it felt like I'd suddenly walked for 20 miles and I kind of almost, in a nice way, it was like it just glided past without me really being aware of it.
Yeah.
Some days, I don't want to give the impression that I was walking for 8 months in this state of kind of sublime bliss.
Yeah.
Some days were horrible. They were tiring. You get those thoughts going around in your head that just won't go away. Bits of songs, stupid stuff that just, gets churned up and you can't get rid of. But I think knowing that I was writing about the experience, and I always had a notebook at hand, and I'd stop, frequently to kind of write down thoughts and ideas. I guess that was the kind of companionship, and that's what stops it being a lonely experience, that you're kind of sharing it with yourself for a reason.
Yeah. So
that was kind of what I would spend a lot of my time doing, and thinking in those terms, thinking in terms of which, maybe like taking a picture isn't really being in the moment, because half the time I was in my head, in my thoughts, constructing bits of sentences and going like, oh, that's a clever, interesting idea.
Yeah.
Rather than actually being there on the road in the dust and the heat, in a forest.
You didn't really have a set time that you wanted to accomplish this, right? It's just like, so I mean, I guess, because again, most of these, when it's like these big escapades, a big adventure, it's usually, okay, we have to start April 2nd and we have to be done by May 15th, right? Whatever. It's like there's a cap on how long they can go. And it seems like here it wasn't about that, because you're not in competition with anyone. You're not trying to break some sort of world record. It's just you're doing this for yourself. And I guess how long, or maybe you knew this right off the bat, but how long, if not, did it take you to realize that you're actually not in competition with the bicycle or the cars or any other forms of transport that were kind of whizzing by you on a daily? Because I feel like it's a great analogy for life, right? Because we often feel like we are in competition with peers, family, friends, coworkers, etc. And I do this all the time as well. But at the end of the day, it's really us versus the person in the mirror.
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote about this at the start of my book, actually. And the first couple of weeks were a very hard adjustment, because I did find myself mentally in competition with everything. With, in Holland, there's lots of cycling. Often I was walking on cycle paths because they're a really great way of getting between towns.
Yeah.
But seeing the bicycles go past and just envying them for how easily they were moving. And then to say nothing of cars and trains, and the adjustment of, I remember probably on my second or third day, just seeing the church steeple of the city that I was staying in that night. And normally when you see something, when you see your destination, you're basically there, because if you're in a car or a train or even on a bike, you're kind of you see something and then you're there quite soon afterwards. But just staring at this steeple and walking and staring and walking, and it just didn't get any bigger, and walking and walking and walking, and sort of forgetting what I was doing, looking back up, and it was still there just as far away. And it was quite hard to remind myself that I wanted to go slowly. That was the whole point. Mm-hmm. But that was I think the biggest readjustment was in the first few weeks of kind of understanding that the whole point was going slowly, and I'm not meant to be at that steeple yet. I have to find something else on the way that is of interest, or I can kind of occupy my mind with.
I would think that would be the hardest part, honestly, because it's such an innate thing to be in competition with everything and everyone around us all the time. And I would think the hardest thing is to be like, I don't care about anyone around me. They're irrelevant. I'm doing this for me. I'm not on their schedule. I'm not on their pace. I'm on my pace and my schedule. Like for me, I think psychologically, that would probably be the hardest part.
Yeah. I think, it is. It is hard. I think it is hard. But once I'd learned that trick, it was quite addictive, that kind of sudden realization of freedom. And it was a great feeling to be, coming down a hillside in some rural landscape in Eastern Europe and knowing that no one was waiting for me. No one really knew where I was, very roughly, perhaps.
Yeah.
But there was a great sense of freedom to that. And that in those moments, I kind of imagined I was glimpsing what my predecessor had gone in search of, was that kind of, the old freedom of the open road of kind of. And also it got, I mentioned before that I started this walk in December. So because I wanted to leave on the same date that he had left to kind of replicate the experience.
Oh, so you left in winter?
I left in winter, which meant I was walking through Bavaria and Austria in like deep snow.
Yeah.
In deep cold, I think it was the coldest winter they'd had in, I can't remember, but it was like a particularly cold, snowy.
Lucky
winter. You. But it did. I was happy that happened because I kind of wanted to see Bavaria and Austria in the snow and the ice. It was kind of fitted that, it fulfilled that desire to have that kind of experience of seeing the Alps covered in snow and, little
beautiful.
Houses with glowing windows and wood stacked up outside and smoke coming from the chimneys. But one thing that meant is I had to be much more organized actually in the first few months, partly because they were more expensive countries, especially Austria. So I couldn't rely on just pitching up and finding a guest house somewhere. Often I was doing it through couch surfing, so I was arranging places to stay for free. And that requires some organization. And obviously you can change your plans, you're not beholden to anyone, but say you've kind of stacked up 4 places in a row to stay, and then you take a day longer, you have to rearrange with everyone. And it just became this kind of organizational thing that took me away from the spirit of the walk. And then I kind of just learned to trust myself more, and I guess trust the world a bit more. So I slept going down the Rhine, I slept in a series of abandoned, ruined Gothic castles, just kind of finding just a little place under an archway and taking out my sleeping bag and kind of curling up. And then in Austria, I found that they have these hunting towers, wooden structures on stilts that people shoot deer from. But they were all unoccupied. They were, freezing, but they were dry and they were sheltered. So I could kind of find a little place in there. Okay. So I found these just a way of sleeping rough, I guess, in the landscape. And then after that, once it started getting to spring and summer, I bought a tent when I was in Budapest, and then that just kind of opened up everything. Suddenly I didn't need to be endlessly organizing where I was going to stay in certain places. It was just, I did have places to stay, and I had organized some things in advance, but just the freedom of just being able to put up my tent alongside a river in somewhere that felt safe and kind of unpopulated, and felt okay.
Yeah.
It made it a different walk from that point.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of what I was thinking. Logistics. I mean, so if you start December, I mean, December, January, February, March, April is probably when it starts to kind of the sun starts to come out, and the temps are nice, so you don't freeze outside. So for those 4 or 5 months, what do? You don't sleep outside, you sleep indoors, I'm assuming. And you have to, because you don't cover a lot of ground because you're walking, I don't know, what was it, how many miles or kilometers, I guess, would you walk on average a day?
Well, it was about 20 miles, I think, was the kind
20 miles?
Yeah, I did, going much over that, I think it's just it becomes a slog, and it's painful, and you feel awful, aching the next day.
Yeah.
So about 20 miles most days, I think.
So you would have to set up someplace, you would have to find a place every 20 miles for you to sleep, essentially, right? At least for the first few months, because obviously it was cold outside.
Yeah. And I did, like I say, I did kind of sleep in those cold months in, undercover, but outside without not in a tent, but in these kind of
sleeping bag
and a sleeping bag, and yeah. But the actual route, the sort of 20-mile thing, was set up for me in that, that's the route I was following. That he had gone from one village to another and walked about the same distance as I had every day. But it was I stayed with all kinds of people, and in some wonderful, strange circumstances, and then what seemed to happen again as I got kind of east is that people would kind of do it for me. I might stay somewhere and they'd say, "Oh, I've got a cousin, in this town you're going through, so I'm going to call them up," and I sort of got handed along a little bit by various people.
So did a lot of people, were they hospitable? They're like, "Please, come sleep in our house. Please come have, dinner, have a beer with us," that kind of thing?
Yeah. People were amazingly hospitable all the way through. I got taken on camping trips. I got taken on, people's relatives' birthdays. It was. There was one town in Hungary. I never got to the bottom of this. I was approaching this town. Someone sent me an email saying, "I've heard about your walk. I own a hotel in this town where I was heading, and you're welcome to stay." So I turned up imagining I'd meet this person that had invited me, and they weren't even there. They just left instructions for the staff to kind of give me a bed, give me a meal.
Crazy.
And I never found out who this person was. They never contacted me again. But
really,
yeah, just things like that would kind of pop up, and became sort of completely one of the things I guess when I had the idea of doing this walk, there were two things I really wanted to find out. And one was how the landscapes of Europe had changed in that time.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one was how the people had changed, particularly in terms of hospitality. And I think there's a kind of narrative that everyone is suspicious and you can't hitchhike anymore. And you're kind of, everyone's scared of each other, and that kind of freedom doesn't exist in the same way, that we've somehow lost that innocence. But it's not true from what I found at all. People were astonishingly hospitable. And then in the final stretch, when I got to Turkey, I was I couldn't walk through a village. It would take me 2 hours, because people would invite me for tea, and you have to have 3 cups of tea with each person. And I'd leave 3 cups of tea and then walk around the corner, and there'd be somebody else calling me over, like giving me 3 cups of tea. So it was quite hard. I kind of almost found myself avoiding villages at one point. It's just like,
there's only so much tea I can have.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's again, it's back to what I was saying about in Oklahoma, right? I think there's the news or social media or whatever it is that wherever we consume our content, they put out the worst, right? Like if something happens, a hitchhiker gets murdered or something, right? Or even sometimes they exaggerate things that maybe happened. And then they kind of slowly that chips away at our foundation, at our trust in humanity and how we see people. And I think an experience like yours, no one, unless you obviously talk about it, but like it's not something the news is going to cover in a way like, oh, man crosses Europe completely fine, greeted by all these people and they were super nice. That's not a headline story for them. They want the if it bleeded leads type story. And I don't know. That's why I love these type of stories, because for the most part, most places you go, people are really nice and people are really hospitable. And like the story you said with the hotel, I mean, I think he didn't have to do that. That was just a nice thing he wanted to do for you, and he got nothing in return.
Yeah, nothing at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I'd kind of learned, it really, and it's sort of completely obvious, but it's the kind of attitude you go with does determine how people accept you. Because I'd find there were some days, when I just wasn't feeling like it, and I didn't want to be looked at and kind of be this stranger. And so I found, a few places I'd go into a village, and I just think, oh, this like people are horrible here. People are just kind of, no one was welcoming me. They were just kind of, suspicious looks and sort of what seemed like barely veiled hostility. Mm-hmm. And always I'd look back on it and go, I was in a really bad mood that day. And so I was probably walking down their street without making eye contact, without, really kind of offering anything, looking like I wanted to avoid people's gaze and kind of get out of there as soon as possible. Of course, they're not going to, they're going to respond to the energy that I'm bringing.
Yep.
So I found that happened a lot. And often it was a case, even if I didn't particularly want to, I found that asking directions was actually a really good, I'd find myself asking directions often, even if I knew exactly where I was going, just because it was a way of telling them, I'm walking to this place and I'm asking for your assistance.
Yeah.
And people are normally very happy to help, to share their knowledge. So often I'd find myself kind of pretending to memorize instructions that I knew exactly what I was doing, just to kind of establish that initial contact. And
yeah, it's a great icebreaker.
Yeah.
In your TED talk, you said it defeats the purpose to talk about an 8 months walk in 15 minutes, right? But here, on the podcast, you can talk as long as you want, essentially. Are there certain moments maybe that you remember, for good or bad, that you maybe want to expand on, that you didn't have time to talk about on TED Talk?
Yeah, I'm sure there are. I mean, one of the amazing experiences, I think, was crossing the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, and just having that kind of, I think it was the first time I was properly, what Europe is beautiful, but it's very cultivated and populated. And the Carpathians were suddenly stepping into true wilderness, where there's wolves.
Did you actually have to do any mountaineering, or was it just, how raw are we talking?
I mean, I wasn't climbing up with ropes, although maybe I should have been. But it was the first time I've kind of walked in mountains where you're not just going on a sort of recreational loop for the hell of it.
I see.
You're going over the mountain because the mountain is directly in the way of where you want to go. And it really changed that whole, it was like a kind of, I'm not going back. So I found I wasn't expecting, it was summer by that point. I wasn't really expecting snow, but I met deep snow up in the tops. And just the kind of the experience of of reaching a point beyond which I couldn't turn around, going up very steep banks of snow where I wasn't sure if I could get back down even if I wanted to, and just trusting that the path that I'd been told exists exists. And it would
Yeah.
lead me over the top and kind of down the other side to where I wanted to go. It felt like a kind of, sort of watershed moment, I think, crossing that mountain range and saying goodbye to this whole swathe of land that I'd crossed over pretty much on the flat. And then suddenly that was the next chapter, was kind of south and Bulgaria and Turkey and this whole new world, really.
No, Romania is amazing. I've my uncle lives there, and in Brasov, and I'll get pictures sometimes, and the whole area looks amazing. Did you see that? There was a Netflix movie that just came out maybe like a week ago, Romanian one, The Father Who Moved Mountains, I think it was called.
No,
and it was based on a real story. Essentially, this father, he gets word that his kid is missing, and he, I guess, went hiking up in these mountains in Romania, disappeared, and the father did essentially everything he could to try to find the kid in the mountains. And so the whole movie is them in the mountains, and they kind of give up, and he's like, no, we have to find him. And I don't want to, spoiler alert for whoever didn't see the movie. I don't want to ruin it, but they don't find the kid, but the father does everything in his power. It's an amazing. I think it's my first time watching a Romanian movie. It was an amazing movie, really.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah. Sorry for ruining the end, by the way, but
it's okay. I'll watch it for the dialogue and the landscapes.
Yeah, no, it's great. In your book, so your book is Outlandish: Walking Europe's Unlikely Landscapes, and
so this is the latest book.
The latest book, correct?
Not the book about the book about that walk was called Walking the Woods and the Water.
Okay, my bad. So can you explain a little bit more about what this book is? And I'm interested why you called it, taking us across landscape that should not be there. You've said that.
Okay, so this is actually, it's a good point to talk about it, because there's 3 travel books I've written, and they kind of form a loose trilogy, very loose, they're all about walking in Europe. So Walking the Woods and the Water is that walk to Istanbul. I wrote a second book called Where the Wild Winds Are, which is 4 walks in search of different winds in Europe, named winds, which I became fascinated with, these kind of winds that blow between countries, often between cultures, and often people have very deep psychological associations with, and they go into history and science and myth and all kinds of things. So that was walks in the north of England, south of France, the Adriatic coastline from Italy down to Croatia, and in the Swiss Alps, on the trail of these 4 invisible pathways, as I saw them. Okay. And then the latest book that came out in May is called Outlandish, and again, it's a book based around 4 walks, like the Winds book, but in each one I go to something that I kind of came to call unlikely landscapes, that bits of land that shouldn't really be there. They're kind of climatological or cultural outliers. So the first landscape of that book is in the Cairngorms, which are mountains in the north of Scotland, northeast of Scotland. And the Cairngorms is the only bit of Britain that classifies as alpine Arctic tundra. Okay. It's a tundra landscape, more similar to Greenland or Scandinavia, or Alaska. There's Britain's only free-ranging reindeer herd there. Oh, wow. And all of these kind of links to the far north that go into the culture as well, and these sort of ancient reindeer herding cultures and similarities to Scandinavia, the Sami people. So I see that as a kind of exclave of the Arctic that's just happened to be stuck in the middle of Britain, or the north of Britain. Yeah. So it's 4 ideas like that. The other ones are the Białowieża forest in Poland and Belarus, which is the last big remnant of the ancient wildwood that covered the North European plain. So it's 12,000 years old. The heart of it hasn't been touched for 800 years. And especially, in the middle of Europe, this is kind of astonishing that you can have this swathe of old growth forest that's somehow existed for centuries and thousands of years. So that's almost like a kind of patch of, it's this primeval woodland that is in modern Europe. And then the other two are the south of Spain contains Europe's only desert. It's called Tabernas. It's in Almeria in the southeast. And it's where they filmed all the Sergio Leone films, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Oh, yeah.
Dollars, all the spaghetti westerns.
Yeah.
Because it looks like the Badlands of, like Arizona. It's this kind of rocky canyon land. And so that's a little bit of North America sort of stranded in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, I went back to Hungary, actually, to go to a region that I didn't go through when I walked to Istanbul. But it's the last uncultivated stretch of they call it the pusta, and it's the Estep grassland. So it kind of culturally and environmentally, it connects Hungary to China. It goes
China.
right through Kazakhstan, southern Russia, Mongolia. It's the Great Steppe, the Eurasian steppe that the Mongolian armies galloped across, and the Huns and all the invaders from the east came down this kind of corridor of grassland straight into the heart of Europe. And Hungary is this kind of, I mentioned before, the language is unique in Europe. It doesn't really have any neighbors. And the reason for that is because it's an Asian language. It's Central Asian nomadic language that came with these kind of horseback warriors and just ended up in the middle of Europe. And so there's all these like fascinating cultural links between Hungary and the Central Asian steppe. So that was
really
an exploration of that. Yeah,
I had no idea.
Well, just as a great kind of way of good illustration of this, it was how I ended the book was going to, the weirdest festival I've ever been to, which was called the Kurultai, and that's a Mongolian word. It's a kind of big horse gathering.
Okay.
But it's a celebration that happens once every 2 years of the steppe identity of the kind of ancient Hungarian people.
Okay.
So they're not looking to Europe for their ancestry. They're looking east, to these sort of Asian horse nomads. And so at this festival, there were Mongolian people there. There were people from Kyrgyzstan, different Russian republics.
In Hungary?
In the middle of Hungary, yeah.
So
they'd all come all the way from Mongolia to kind of demonstrate horseback archery and that kind of thing. But it was a strange mix between, on one level, it was the kind of craft fair folk festival, lots of traditional crafts and traditional costumes. On another level, it was a kind of medieval reenactment. So there were lots of people dressed as, Mongol warriors and Huns and that kind of thing. And then there was another element that was bordering on neo-Nazi, kind of far right, ethno-nationalist, Hungarian, fascist, essentially.
Yeah.
But they were not looking at kind of Caucasian identity. They're seeing their sort of macho fantasy as being lived out in this idea of being a horseback warrior, galloping around, sacking a village. But they were there with people from Turkey, people from Mongolia, dancing to the sound of goatskin bagpipes.
What in the world?
utterly bizarre.
That is the weirdest combination of people together that I've ever heard.
Yeah, someone I asked about it said to me, this is the only place where, after midnight you can find a conservative Muslim dancing with a skinhead. There were people there from, Turkey who'd come to kind of represent this sort of Turkic nomadic culture.
Yeah.
Mixing it up with people that under other circumstances would have been violently hostile, I think.
What is this event called again?
It's called the Kurultai.
I'm going to look into this. I've never heard of this. This is fascinating.
it is one of the, culturally one of the most interesting things I've seen, but it was just a perfect example of this kind of Hungarian fascination with Asia and with the East, and especially with actually on the walk 10 years ago, I saw kind of the start of what was happening in Hungarian politics, where there was this very right-wing element coming in, and it's only got much more extreme since then. But there's this kind of, I guess it's a sort of fascist tendency to look back to the glory days, and especially the kind of proud warrior culture that they imagine was pure and kind of free and strong, uncorrupted. But as they've turned away from the EU and all of its kind of liberal decadence, there's people looking east as the kind of, the source of their strength and revival. Wow.
Yeah, I'm going to look into that. Is that something you learned on your walk, or is how did you get that information about this crazy festival? Is it something you learned on the walk, or just researching?
Yeah, it was researching, I think, just looking up these kind of links between Hungary and I saw on my walk, 10 years ago, walking the woods and the water, I kept on seeing the basically like runic letters, runes, on village road signs. So you'd have the Hungarian name of the village, and then you'd have these unreadable runes. Mm-hmm. And I asked a few people about this, and they all thought it was very silly. People I talked to, and they're like, that's the government. It's an ancient kind of Turkic script that people believe the ancestors of the Hungarians once spoke. So it's the equivalent of the Norwegian government making their road signs in Viking runes. Yeah. And obviously nobody can read them. They were just like, I've got no idea what it says. It's kind of, people were laughing at it. But it was a little clue to kind of what was happening. Yeah.
That's wild. Well, I want to switch it up just a little bit. I recently saw, I think it was on Twitter, that you posted, and you said you were going on, or maybe somewhere else, but glacier funerals. And I can, hypothesize what I think that is, but can you explain what you meant by that?
Yes, sure. So this is a long non-fiction. It's not a book. It's a long non-fiction piece.
Okay.
Commissioned to write, and it's about. Well, I did touch on this at the end of Outlandish, with this idea of climate change and how kind of the north is changing, melting, and so I followed a series of links, I guess, and kind of conversations that led me to a glacier funeral in Switzerland, which is what I've just got back from a week ago. So there's a glacier called Bassodino, which is in Ticino, in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, Southern Alps. And a team of glaciologists and kind of climate activists and educators have organized two of these events before in Switzerland. There's been one in the French-speaking part, one in the German-speaking part. This is one in the Italian part. And so there was a glaciologist there called Giovanni Kappenberger who was kind of organizing it. And he's studied this glacier for 30 years and has reached the conclusion that there's still ice there. The top of the mountain is still covered in ice, but it's no longer flowing as a glacier has to do to kind of classify as a glacier. Mm-hmm. And it's melting to an extent where it's kind of terminal. And they're looking at 10 years of some ice being up there, but basically it's kind of the end, it's gone. So they've organized a funeral as partly as a camp, to get attention and to try and focus people on what's happening, but partly as a genuine expression of the people that have had a relationship with this body of ice for years and years and have now seen it disappear. So it was a beautiful event. They had people carrying stones up the mountain to make a kind of shrine to the glacier. And they had a Catholic priest who had come to read.
Oh, they went all out.
A benediction. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And then readings, and the choir was singing. So it was quite it was a colourful event, and, you know, full of kind of joy in some senses, but also people who were deeply saddened by seeing, you know, their mountains change forever.
Yeah. Ah, that's depressing. Yeah. It's whenever I hear this type of stuff, it's just depressing. There's really not much more to say. You know, I feel like at this point, all the information's out there. You know, we're losing our glaciers, sea level rise, coral bleaching, you know, CO2 in the air, all the doom and gloom is out there. All the information's out there. And the fact that we as a global community can't move the needle, can't really do the necessary steps in order to ensure our own, because, you know, the world will be fine. The world is going to be here long after we're gone, but we can't ensure our own longevity on this little ball that's spinning around the vacuum of the universe. Is I don't know what that says about us.
Well, I don't know either. I think, and I'm interested in how, and I think a lot of my writing goes into how cultures and how people, what do you do? How do you live? How do you respond? How do you carry on? And this funeral for me was part of that, of just a kind of, you know, a ceremony that really has no precedent, to acknowledge the death of something that's older and bigger than we can really imagine.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was interesting to me that they brought the church in, that the Catholic priest was there to say goodbye to something that I imagine in his eyes cannot have a soul. You know, it's not a kind of living thing as a human is a living thing. But I found it very interesting that it was the scientists who referred to the glacier as dead.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that sounds like an unscientific thing.
Yeah.
But to them, they were saying it used to be living in that it was moving and it was a viable kind of body. So to bring that language of death and funerals into a vast body of ice, I kind of saw it as it's a slightly clumsy but very beautiful attempt to negotiate being a human now in this very bizarre time that we're all living through.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It seems I'm always torn between trying to stay optimistic and relay information and having, you know, climate scientists on and people that know the information way better than I do. And I don't know, influencing a few people. Hopefully they influence a few people, and on and on and on. And then sometimes I'm just not that optimistic. And I feel like we're on a runaway train that there's nothing really left to do. And again, it's one of those inner battles where I'm like, all right, stay optimistic. You know, we still got time. And it just really also, you know, there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there. And it's hard to know who to listen to sometimes, you know. There's some people that sound very convincing and they show you a lot of graphs and stats. And then there's the other side, and they're trying to relay their point as well as their agenda. And I can understand why it's confusing for people sometimes. And, you know, in the grand scheme of things, I think a lot of people have to feed their family and you know, bring money in and pay the bills, and they maybe don't have time to, or even the capacity to think about these humongous things, right? Like, how am I going to take care of the earth? But it's one of those things where, I don't know. We just have to. I mean, I don't know what the answer is. I'm just thinking out loud here, but I don't know. It's just daily actions. Be a bit more mindful. Do the small things we can, maybe. I don't know.
One of the other things I do is work for a publication. I'm a co-director of something called the Dark Mountain Project, which we bring out. We're a publisher. We bring out 2 hardback books every year of kind of what I guess loosely termed ecological writing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very much the kind of focus is what I was saying before is how do we navigate this descent without going either complete denialist or without going doom, I'm not gonna, there's nothing. It's somewhere the difficult work is that area in between, that we, it's not a kind of dropping off a cliff so much as a very difficult descent down a steep pathway where you might stumble quite a lot, but it's not just falling. You're kind of engaged in living, which is doing all the other things you've got to do, paying the bills and falling in love and everything else we do as humans.
Yeah.
But having that reality of a world that is, in crisis and changing in some good ways too, also in a lot of terrible ways. It's not a black and white time. It's a very grey, confused time, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, 100%. Are you optimistic?
I think by nature, yeah, I'd say I am. I think that's where the spirit level bubble kind of tends to sort of bob up to a level where day to day I feel fairly optimistic, although I'm constantly aware of all of the things that I've got absolutely no right to be optimistic about in terms of the planet.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, being on, again, it's very hard to just at this glacier funeral, for example, I was there for about a week kind of with this glacier and spending time with it and walking up there most days. And it's very hard, I found, to even hold in my own mind. And I'd come all that way to sort of be there and to sort of engage with this stuff. And I'd find myself constantly forgetting it was just too hard to take in. I couldn't really believe deeply that this was melting. It just seems so impossible.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to focus sometimes on actually what's happening because it's too big.
I think it's similar to what you said earlier, where where the vistas are too big, you can't take it all in. I think this is a similar thing. It's just, it's too big. It's like not something my puny brain can take in, can absorb. So I just try to do what I can. And that's all I can do. Just do what I can,
There's a guy I could recommend. I don't know if you've come across Andri Snare Magnusson.
I had him on the podcast.
Oh, you did? Okay,
yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, because he actually organized the first glacier funeral in Iceland. He wrote.
Yeah.
He wrote.
Oh, yeah. I remember. I should remember. I had him on the podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. I just mentioned him because I think he's very, very good at communicating how to take in, sort of breaking down how to take in these big things. Yeah.
He's got a good book on time and water, right?
Yeah. Yeah, on time and water. Yeah, it's very good. But there's a very memorable bit in that where he's sitting with various members of his family who are quite long-lived. He's got his elderly to kind of young generation, and just realizing that around that table is something like 200 or 250 years of human experience.
Yeah.
And suddenly you see that these stretches of time, they're not very long at all. We experience them as long. I guess it's like the walk I did, walking across Europe. I think it was, just decades after it had changed. And it's not that long ago at all. You can still see the scars of the war. You can still see what happened. You're still meeting people who experienced, a woman in Budapest telling me about her mother hiding in a basement while the Russian troops, kind of rampaged over her head. And that was so real to her. It was kind of recent memory.
Yeah. Yeah. That's crazy how that happens. Well, I think to end on a positive, I think the positive here is a lesson from, the walk you did, where at the end of the day, people probably, they want the same thing, right? They, they want community, they want family, they want love, they want to take care of one another. And they just want to live in peace, and we often let all these other issues fog up our existence but I think that's the gist of it. Like, for the most part, people are good. They want to live in peace, and we should celebrate that more than the other things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very simple lesson, but I do believe it's true.
Yeah.
There's a kind of Bertrand Russell quote that I'm probably misquoting, where he was asked at the end of his long life, what have you learned as a philosopher? And he said something like, people should just try and be a bit nicer to each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's
it's really that simple.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly my experience of walking around, potentially being very vulnerable, has been that people have generally or overwhelmingly been kind and generous. And it's a good thing to take away from an experience like that.
Yeah. Well, we'll end on that happy note. Nick Hunt, thank you so much, man. This was a pleasure. Thanks for being on the podcast. Where can people find you? Where can they buy the books? Just let the good people know. Okay,
so the good people should know that books are available. Well, they are available on Amazon, but if you can possibly go to a local bookshop and get your books there, that's much better for me and for the bookshop and for the world generally. Walking the Woods and the Water, Where the Wild Winds Are, Outlandish. I also wrote a book about parakeets in London that I haven't mentioned yet, exploring the strange urban myths around the existence of green parakeets in London. That's called The Parakeeting of London. Okay. I've got a website, nickhuntScrutiny.com, and I'm on Twitter as @underscrutiny. I think that's the only places I'm at. But bookshops, if you want to know more, I'd really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll be sure to link everything in the show notes, so I'll make it easy for you guys to find everything. Go check them out. Go check the books out. And again, Nick, thanks so much, man. I really had fun today.
Thank you.
All right, take care, buddy.